everyone. I'm pleased to welcome all of you to my personal website where we take a look at U.S. history from a variety of different angles. We try to get the story behind the story. We try to take a look at some of the odd things that have happened and some of the personalities who have shaped this American experience that we have. And we hopefully, when we're done, you will have an appreciation of what a really remarkable event in history the United States of America is and its incredible Constitution. So as you listen and watch and learn, I hope that you decide you're going to come back here often and enjoy this experience of History by Lou. Three little words: critical race theory. And it really wasn't part of our discussion even 2 years ago, but it has become a major issue and is being politicized very greatly. Now, I'm going to try to explain what it is today and some of the background of it, but I expect you all to still be a little bit confused when we're done because it's hard to understand. And even if I've been trying for a long time to put this presentation together, I'm still not feeling like I've really gotten all included that needs to be, but we'll do the best I can with it. A critical race theory. I love if you search the cartoons. This is a subject that is just ripe fodder for the cartoons, and there are lots and lots of them. I had to wean out a few that I thought were good. Critical race theory isn't taught at my school. Nevertheless, parents are worried about it. Maybe we should be more concerned with things that do happen at schools, like shootings. And here's one. This is the guy who did a lot of cartooning of me back in the day. He must be getting really old at this point. Critical race theory. If they can't teach it, it never happened. It's a sack in the Star and Tribune. And this one, nothing called CRT is being taught. Yeah, but ban educational programs that teach that individuals of any race, ethnicity, color, or national origin are inherently superior or inferior wouldn't fit. And therein is sort of the nub of it. It's a critical race theory is so easy to use as a phrase, a rallying phrase, an inflammatory phrase, that nobody really knows what it means. I like this one. The ape, you're a monkey with GOP, against school teaching about sexual orientation, gender, racism, and evolution too. Did that happen? Does that happen? So, just what is critical race theory anyway? Critical race theory is an academic concept that's more than 40 years old. The core idea is that race is a social construct, not biological, and that racism is not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but also something embedded in legal systems and policies. They're pointing out that everything we do in some way is colored by race in this society. The basic tenets of critical race theory, or as we'll abbreviate it, CRT, emerged out of a framework for legal analysis in the late 1970s and early 1980s by some legal scholars. A good example is when in the 1930s, government officials literally drew lines around areas deemed poor financial risks, often explicitly due to the racial composition of the inhabitants. Banks subsequently refused to offer mortgages to Black people in those areas. The practice is called redlining, and it's strictly illegal. But in a very subtle way, it may still be happening. Today, those same patterns of discrimination live on through facially race-blind policies like single-family zoning that prevents the building of affordable housing in advantaged majority white neighborhoods and thus stymies racial desegregation efforts. In other words, keeping white areas white. CRT also has ties to other intellectual currents, including the work of sociologists, literary theorists, and who studied links between political power, social organization, and language. And its ideas have been informed in other fields like the humanities, the social sciences, teacher education. The academic understanding of critical race theory differs from representation in recent popular books, and especially from its portrayal by critics, often, though not exclusively, conservative Republicans. Critics charge that the theory leads to negative dynamics such as a focus on group identity over universal shared traits, divides people into oppressed and oppressor groups, and urges intolerance. Thus, there is a good deal of confusion over what CRT means, as well as its relationship to other terms like anti-racism and social justice, with which it's often combined and which are different things. To an extent, the term critical race theory is now cited as the basis of all diversity and inclusion efforts, regardless of how much it's actually informing those programs. So what is critical race theory and why are we hearing about it now? One conservative organization, the Heritage Foundation, recently attributed a whole host of issues to CRT. And boy, I got on their mailing list somehow, and they keep asking me for money. Money, 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 boy, do they want money. And guess what they get from me? Anyway, including they go after the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests. Remember those? LGBTQ clubs in schools, diversity training in federal agencies and organizations, California's recent ethnic studies model curriculum, and the free speech debate on college campuses and alternatives to exclusionary discipline, such as the Promise program in Broward County, Florida, that some parents blame for the Parkland school shootings. When followed to its logical conclusion, CRT is destructive and rejects the fundamental ideas on which our constitutional republic is based, the organization claimed. This is the Heritage Foundation. Does critical race theory say all white people are racist? Well, if they do, isn't that racist too? The theory says that racism is part of everyday life, so people, white or non-white, who don't intend to be racist can nevertheless make choices that fuel racism. Some critics claim that the theory advocates discriminating against white people in order to achieve equity. They mainly aim those accusations at theorists who advocate for policies that explicitly take race into account. Fundamentally, though, the disagreement springs from different conceptions of racism. CRT puts an emphasis on outcomes, not merely on individuals' own beliefs, and it calls on those outcomes to be examined and rectified. See, that's what's academic. They're trying to come to a final conclusion, but they're doing like all researchers do. Just take a look at it. Take it in balance. Look at the pros, cons, ups, and downs. Among lawyers, teachers, policymakers, and the general public, there are many disagreements about how precisely to do those things and to what extent race should be explicitly appealed to or referred to in the process. We are a confused people. Here's a helpful illustration to keep in mind in understanding it. In a 2007 U.S. Supreme Court school assignment case on whether race could be a factor in maintaining diversity in K-12 schools, Chief Justice John Roberts' opinion famously concluded, quote, "The way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race." Oh, close quote. Well, think about that. But during oral arguments, then Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, quote, "It's very hard for me to see how you can have a racial objective, but not non-racial means to get there," close quote. All these different ideas grow out of long-standing, tenacious intellectual debates. Critical race theory emerged out of postmodernist thought, which tends to be skeptical of the idea of universal values, objective knowledge, individual merit, Enlightenment rationalism, and liberalism, tenets that conservatives tend to hold dear. What does any of this have to do with K-12 education? Scholars who study critical race theory in education look at how policies and practices in K-12 education contribute to the persistent racial inequalities in education, and they advocate for ways to change them. Among the topics they've studied are racially segregated schools, the underfunding of majority Black and Latino school districts, disproportionate disciplining of Black students, barriers to gifted programs, and selective admission high schools and curricula that reinforce racist ideas. Love this cartoon. It's a takeoff on the days when you had to have federal marshals escort a young child to school. This was a Norman Rockwell original painting. Critical race theory is not a synonym for culturally relevant teaching, which emerged in the 1990s. That teaching approach seeks to affirm students' ethnic and social and racial backgrounds and is intellectually rigorous. But it's related in that one of its aims is to help students identify and critique the causes of social equality in their own lives. Many educators support, to one degree or another, culturally relevant teaching and other strategies to make schools feel safe and supportive for Black students and other underserved populations. But they don't necessarily identify those activities as CRT related. As one teacher educator put it, quote, "The way we usually see any of this in a classroom is, have I thought about how my Black students feel and made a space for them so they can be successful?" That is the level I think it stays at for most teachers. Some argue that to change grading practices or to make the curriculum less Eurocentric, which it is substantially, will ultimately harm Black students or hold them to a less high standard. As with CRT in general, its popular representation in schools has been far less nuanced. A recent poll by a group called Parents Defending Education claimed some schools were teaching that, quote, "white people are inherently privileged, while Black and other people of color are inherently oppressed and victimized," close quote. That achieving racial justice and equality between racial groups requires discriminating against people based on their whiteness, and that the United States was founded on racism. Another cartoon I love. Kool-Aid kids, critical race theory. Look like one of the teachers you used to have, I don't know. So, thus much of the current debate appears to spring not from the academic texts, but from fear among critics that students, especially white students, will be exposed to supposedly damaging or self-demoralizing ideas, that being white is bad. While some district officials have issued mission statements, resolutions, or spoken about changes in their policies using some of the discourse of CRT, it's not clear to what degree educators are explicitly teaching the concepts or even using curriculum materials or other methods that implicitly draw on them. For one thing, scholars say, much scholarship on CRT is written in academic language or published in journals not easily accessible to K-12 teachers. And K-12 teachers basically don't care or have the time to get into this argument as deeply as the scholars in the colleges do. So what's going on with these proposals to ban critical race theory in schools? Well, as of mid-May, legislation purported to outlaw CRT in schools has passed in Idaho, Iowa, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Florida, New Hampshire, and Tennessee, and have been proposed in various other states, and I think one just passed in the last few days. The bills are so vaguely written that it's unclear what they will affirmatively cover. Could a teacher who wants to talk about a factual instance of state-sponsored racism, like the establishment of Jim Crow, the series of laws that prevented Black Americans from voting or holding office and separated them from white people in public places, be considered in violation of these laws? Now, if you teach about Jim Crow, if you mention Jim Crow, does that mean you violated the laws? It's also unclear whether these new bills are constitutional or whether they impermissibly restrict free speech. We still have the Constitution working for us in that regard. And here is a map showing that the states that have banned critical race theory as of right now, and more of them are going to take it up. And as you see, the darker blue ones have the possible ban in process. Citizens for Renewing America. I want you to read this carefully with me. A model school board language to prohibit critical race theory. This is an organization called Citizens for Renewing America. That sounds good, doesn't it? Citizens for Renewing America. And this is their model school board language. Please read with me. The purpose of this policy or resolution is to prohibit the teaching and promotion of critical race theory, divisive concepts, and other forms of government-sanctioned or facilitated racism in our school district, and to uphold the foundational American principle that all people are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Do you all understand that? Do you all now know what you can't do and what you can do? Isn't that crystal clear? Citizens for Renewing America is the conservative-leaning advocacy founded by a man by the name of Russell Vought, former budget director for President Donald Trump. The group published a handbook for parents and lawmakers opposed to teaching critical race theory in schools, and following the publication, Twitter briefly suspended the organization from its service. Just thought I'd note that. It would be extremely difficult in any case to police what goes on inside hundreds of thousands of classrooms. But social studies teachers might fear that such laws could have a chilling effect on teachers who might self-censor their own lessons out of concern for parent or administrator complaints. So do I stop teaching about Jim Crow just to make sure I don't get in trouble, and therefore deprive students of an understanding of what governed this country for 100 years? An English teacher, Mike Stein, told Chalkbeat, Tennessee about the new law. History teachers cannot adequately teach about the Trail of Tears, also racial. Now, the Civil War, totally racial, and the Civil Rights Movement. English teachers will have to avoid teaching almost any text by an African-American author because many of them mention racism to various extents. The laws could also become a tool to attack other pieces of the curriculum, including ethnic studies and action civics, an approach to civics education that asks students to research local civic problems and to propose solutions. Love this cartoon. This is in 1988. Charles Schulz inducted the first Black character in his classic comic strip Peanuts. And this is what would happen if it were happening today. Hi, I'm very glad to meet you. Hello, systemically racist, privileged white oppressor. We get a little crazy sometimes. How is this related to other debates over what's taught in the classroom amid K-12 cultural wars? The charge that schools are indoctrinating students in a harmful theory or political mindset is a long-standing one, historians note. CRT appears to be the latest salvo in this ongoing debate. In the early and mid-20th century, the concern was about socialism or Marxism. The conservative American Legion, beginning in the 1930s, sought to rid schools of progressive-minded textbooks that encouraged students to consider economic inequality. 2 decades later, the John Birch Society raised similar criticisms about school materials. As with CRT criticisms, the fear was that students would be somehow harmed by exposure to these ideas. When I was at my university, there was a very important financial supporter who was very active in the John Birch Society. And so out of his generosity, he offered an entire library of books dealing with this subject, a very large library of books, like hundreds of books. And the president of the university, who was trying to be as balanced and fair, but still deal with this rich alumnus, what did he do? Well, he took the reading room in the student union and he had a bookshelf constructed in there, and all of these books were put on that shelf. And do you know what happened? Within a very short amount of time, almost all of those books disappeared. They were stolen, they were destroyed. It just happened. But it was a way in which the president could say, "Hey, I made it available to all the students," and they took the material and went with it. I thought it was very clever on the part of the president to do that, because most of the things were never used. As the school-age population became more diverse, these debates have been inflected rather through the lens of race and ethnic representation, including disagreements over multiculturalism and ethnic studies. Now, these are a little different things. The ongoing canon wars, or which texts should make up the English curriculum, and the so-called Ebonics debates over the status of Black vernacular English in schools. In history, the debates have focused on the balance among patriotism and American exceptionalism on one hand, and the country's history of exclusion and violence towards indigenous people and the enslavement of African Americans on the other, between its ideals and practices. It's a great debate. It's been going on from the beginning, and we haven't finished this debate yet. These tensions led to the implosion of a 1994 attempt to set national history standards. A current example that's fueled much of the recent round of CRT criticism is the very famous New York Times 1619 project, which sought to put the history and effects of enslavement, as well as Black Americans' contributions to democratic reforms, at the center of American history. And for example, this was a very erroneous topic. Basically, what the 1619 Project does is it says that slavery and racism are at the heart of every single thing that's happened in U.S. history. Now, let me point out one place where that's absolutely dead wrong. Where did the American Revolution be said to be caught? Where was the shot heard round the world? It was at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, which had virtually no slaves at that time of any great consequence. And it's also true the Boston Tea Party had very little to do with slavery. Many of the things that have happened in U.S. history have nothing to do with racism or slavery. And yet the 1619 Project has tried to maintain that that was what it was. It makes a very big case of how racist Lincoln was. Well, Lincoln was not a racist. Otherwise, he could not have promulgated the things that he did. So anyway, it was a useful thing to consider, but it had many, many errors of fact. And anyway, it's one of those pieces of American history itself now. The culture wars are always at some level battled out within schools, historians say, because they're nervous about broad social things, but they're talking the language of school and school curriculum, said one historian of education. That's the vocabulary, but the actual grammar is anxiety about shifting power relations. So just at a base level, why do schools exist in any nation or any society? Why do schools exist? Why do we create these things and promulgate them from generation to generation? They only have one purpose, and the reason society creates them and allows them to continue is they are to take the current society, the current values, and pass it on to the next generation. Another one here. This is the MAGA type people who have been trying to oppose the cultural wars of tearing down statues. Don't erase our history, and yet they're trying to erase critical race theory. These are the MAGA type people that do this. That cartoonist says. Attempts to censor critical race theory is an uninformed reaction to fear, a reaction that over the long run will be more harmful than helpful to the nation's ability to grapple with its legacy of racism. The words critical and race, especially when put together, seem to operate as red flags that scare people. Oh, yes, frighten them. So let us briefly examine what critical race theory is. It's a stretch to call it an ideology. Merriam and Webster defined ideology as the integrated assertions, theories, and aims that constitute a socio-political program and a systematic body of concepts, especially about human life or culture. Critics of critical race theory, as well as critics of various forms of anti-racism, racist education often base their concerns on the belief that talking about race is what produces racism. And if we're all going to try to be colorblind, then racism will go away. This belief contradicts findings of the numerous research studies reviewed for the National Education Association on the impact of ethnic study courses on students, including white students. Studies find fairly consistently that students, especially white students, begin with shallow conceptions of what racism is. And if racism works, but at the end, of course, that focus on structural racism have generally more positive racial attitudes than they begin with. In other words, knowledge sets you free. Knowledge sets you free. When you begin to understand and know something, you are then free to deal with it in a more intelligent and a more articulate way. In other words, rather than fomenting racial hatred, coursework that examines structural racism generally improves cross-racial understanding. It's easy to hate somebody you don't know and you don't spend any time with or thinking about, but it's harder to hate them when they're your next door neighbor or somebody you associate with. Critical race theory can be understood more accurately as a body of analytical tools for examining how race and racism work, premised on the assumption that race is a social construct rather than a biological fact, and that racism is deeply ingrained in U.S. society. Critical race theory emerged from this group of scholars who wanted to understand why was it that we have all this civil rights legislation and litigation that was to eradicate racism and it didn't achieve its goal? That's part of why they were motivated to study CRT. In other words, following the civil rights movement, most of it in the 1960s, people of color have still experienced ongoing racial discrimination to this day. Why? It's a central question of the analytical tools of critical race theory that they're seeking to understand. For example, one analytical tool is taking seriously people of color's experiences with racism based on the assumption that white people's experience race differently from people of color, but that most public theorizing about race has been done by white people. The unfounded theory that talking about race produces racism is one such theory. Another analytical tool called interest convergence holds that people act on their own self-interest. And do we do that? I think we take an interest in gay activities because of that. We take an interest in the problems of the aging because of that. We take an interest in the people who live in South Florida because of that, and on and on. Interest convergence asks how racial remedies that seem fair to white people actually advance white self-interests. In this brief explanation, if this brief explanation doesn't sound like critical race theory as you've heard it discussed publicly, you probably heard it discussed by people who do not understand it, but extrapolate what they think combining the words critical and race must mean. If I don't recognize critical race theory as it's characterized in the news and on the floor of state legislatures, that's because the boogeyman people have invented out of fear doesn't bear much resemblance to the academic theories studied and used. But I think the deeper question legislators are wrestling with is this: should elementary and secondary age students and youth study race and racism in U.S. society, particularly as framed through the intellectual work of scholars of color? Why does such curriculum teach hate? Does this curriculum teach hate? It's important to realize there's a huge difference between understanding, critiquing, and working to change white supremacy versus hating white people. White supremacy is an institutionalized system that uses power to prioritize the needs and well-being of white people over a people of color based on the assumption that white people are superior. White individuals do not have to uphold white supremacy, and many do not. In fact, challenging white supremacy and building inclusive institutions requires the involvement of white people. If we want to eradicate this nation's legacy of racism, we have to learn to confront racism directly and to see it as a systemic issue and not only an indicator of individual prejudice. Teaching young people about racism is not indoctrination, but rather teaching viewpoints and providing factual data related to racism that they may otherwise are not going to be exposed to. Young people need to make up their own minds about how to think about race, but the better informed they are, the more thoughtfully they will do so. Rather than banning the analytical and pedagogical tools that enable this work, we would get much further if we supported the preparation of teachers to teach race in the schoolhouse as well. Critical race theory is theoretical and interpretive mode that examines the appearance of race and racism across dominant cultural modes of expression. In adopting this approach, the CRT scholars attempt to understand how victims of systemic racism are affected by cultural perceptions of race and how they're able to represent themselves to counter the prejudice, closely related to many other fields, and then examining the legacy of slavery, the civil rights movement, and recent events. The many previous scholars are drawn on, and here you see some of their names: Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass and W.B. Du Bois, and on down the line. Many have done much serious thinking about issues like this. Some common questions: what is the significance of race in contemporary American society? And it's pretty significant. Where, in what ways, and to what ends does race appear in dominant American culture and shape the ways we interact with one another? What types of texts and other cultural artifacts reflect dominant cultural perception of race? How can scholars convey that racism is a concern that affects all members of society? How does racism continue to function as a persistent force in American society? How can we combat racism to ensure that all members of American society experience equal representation and access to fundamental rights? How can we accurately reflect the experiences of the victims of racism? Microaggressions, these are some other term that's sometimes used in this field, refer to the seemingly minute and unconscious quotidian instances of prejudice that collectively contribute to racism and the subordination of radicalized individuals by the dominant culture. So do we do little things that are really racist in their heart? Legal discourse participates in and can counteract the effects of microaggressions. Another term, institutionalized racism. This concept refers to the systemic ways dominant society restricts a radicalized individual or group's access to opportunities. These inequalities, which include an individual's access to material conditions and power, are not only deeply embedded in legal institutions, but have been absorbed into American culture to such a degree that they're often invisible or easily overlooked. Social construction. In the text of CRT, social construction refers to the notion that race is a product of social thought and relations. It suggests that race is a product of neither biology nor genetics, but is rather a social invention. It's not part of biology or genetics, but rather is a social invention. We see this in children who are not inherently racist based on what they see and what they hear from other little children who may be different in color from them, which suggests it's not the biology or genetics, but it's something we then teach them. Intersectionality and anti-essentialism. This refers to the notion that one aspect of an individual's identity does not necessarily determine other categories of membership. Everyone has potentially conflicting, overlapping identities, loyalties, and allegiances. Every single one of us has something that we identify with, something that is unique to us. And that loyalty is conflicting with somebody else. I may be pro-Norwegian because I grew up in a Norwegian community, and someone else may be pro-German, or somebody else may be pro-Spanish because they bring that cultural difference. So they bring that along with them. And those could be overlapping into a great deal, but they can be conflicting too. In other words, we cannot predict an individual's identity, beliefs, or values based on categories like race, gender, sexuality, religion, nationality. Instead, we must recognize that individuals are capable of claiming membership to a variety of different and oftentimes seemingly contradictory categories and belief systems, regardless of the identities outsiders try to impose on them. And so we have this thing emerging. And the backdrop was a common belief in America that the way to solve oppression was to pass legal reforms that expanded existing rights. Scholars who formulated critical race theory were asking, why is it that racial inequality endures and persists even decades after we passed all these laws? Why is racism still enduring, and how do we truly abolish it? That's really what's behind all of this. It's where it came from. And this professor at Harvard is the one who did the initial work and became an important 1989, 1990, was expanded on by others in the 1990s. And it has had many accomplishments, such as aiding in the passage of affirmative action laws, reforming urban planning to decrease segregation, and securing fair housing rights. Ethnic studies, however, is different from critical race theory. The latter examines the way in which the U.S. was built on racist beliefs that can still be found in our systems today. Despite the differences, people are still concerned about the effects race and ethnic studies may have on students, and they could potentially lead to critical race theory being taught. Now, in rural Northern California, just about 60 miles northeast of Sacramento, this is Nevada County, majority white county, home to just under 100,000 people. November 10th, a year or so ago, they held a meeting where critical race theory was discussed. Moreover, outside attendance and comments were heard and encouraged at the meeting. The meeting is a self-proclaimed group known as Protecting American Ideals. See how they get these nice sounding terms for their organizations, gave a brief presentation where they dissected and identified instances of critical race theory in the recent anti-racist efforts. The group showed a PowerPoint presentation where other names for critical race theory were displayed in what seemed like an attempt to warn others what to watch out for. Among these other names, watch out for equity, watch out for social justice, be careful of diversity and equity and inclusion, culturally responsive teaching, and social emotional learning. The group argued that all of these names need to be ridden from our schools. That is the term they use. And this is a cartoon that I love. No one is teaching my kids CRT. And then he says, whatever that is, they don't know. Those who oppose teaching critical race theory, including those at that meeting, often argue it's indoctrinating their children with radical views, or these types of teaching methods force white students to be taught they were born as an oppressor, and black students they were born as a victim. Are white students taught that they are an oppressor? Are black students taught that they are a victim? Further opponents of CRT feel that the concept puts too much emphasis on race and will further contribute to racism against people of all backgrounds. They frequently suggest that a colorblind approach should be taken.
Yeah, Rick, what was supposed to be an informative and not public comment session about the strategic plan for the upcoming school year turned into chaos with more than 12 protesters being kicked out. It was disruption and chaos inside the Van Hoos Education Center Tuesday evening.
If I need to stop this meeting so that we will have order, we can do that. I do not want to hear your comments.
This group making their voices loud to JCPS board members as they were discussing next year's strategic plan for the district. For the meeting, the protesters were outside and held up signs saying they don't want JCPS to teach critical race theory. Critical race theory is the educational study of institutional racism in America and how it affects people of color. JCPS says the district does not teach it, but this group thinks otherwise, with some comparing it to the district's racial equity plan. That policy aims to maintain educational standards for all students, no matter their racial background.
They're calling this equity, not equality, equity. They're trying to skirt under critical race theory, that they're not teaching it. They will be teaching it, but they're calling it the equity program.
They wanted to ask administrators about it, so they went inside for the 6 p.m. work session. Within 30 minutes, they held up signs and sounded off.
And here you are, you want to teach them about equity? Teach them to read. That gives them equity.
There's other cities that let people speak, and you know what else?
JCPS work sessions do not include public comment, but many felt they were entitled to speak.
Okay, let's go, ma'am. We believe. I don't want to go. I have every right to be here because this is,
You have
disrupted the meeting. No, because they won't let us speak. This is what communism does.
Most of the board members left. During the 20 minutes of unrest, about half of the protesters were asked to leave because they were being disrupted.
Amen. No critical race.
What we saw this evening is the outgrowth of pervasive misinformation in our communities, really in communities across the nation.
After the meeting, Superintendent Dr. Marty Polio and others said they're not surprised by the emotion that surrounded this, but board members say they want to make sure all kids from different backgrounds in JCPS get an equal opportunity.
Okay. I picked one video of one school district protest because as an example, I could have had 15 of those because there's a lot of that kind of anger that's going on. Encouraging students to not notice color with hopes that it will eliminate biases has been proven ineffective. Not recognizing our differences invalidates the experiences of minorities, also teaches people to not recognize blatant racial discrimination, furthering the cycle of discrimination. Color blindness approach is solely a way for people to avoid uncomfortable conversations and expose their own biases. Children in schools must be taught to appreciate diversity rather than ignore it, even if it means being uncomfortable in your conversations once in a while. Education does not exist in a vacuum. For it to be effective, it must interact with and address the society around it, including the problems and imperfect parts. Schools must first acknowledge their own biases and then encourage their students to recognize theirs. Without recognizing the biases, we're not going to be able to move to a more equitable society. Moreover, equity is something we should strive for, but not something that should be ridden from our schools. No two students are the same, and we must provide each of them with the appropriate levels of support. Consequently, we must recognize that different racial groups face unavoidable struggles that must not be ignored. These struggles must be taken into account when teaching in order to maximize every student's success. Those who feel threatened by critical race theory and anti-racist efforts in schools should take some time to look inward to see what they're truly advocating for. Do they really want us to stop teaching our students the truth? We want to eliminate large periods of US history just because they don't align with certain political ideals. In addition, those on our school boards and those who hold political office must reject these attempts to halt anti-racist efforts in our schools. These groups, like Protecting American Ideals, cannot be told that their ideas and contributions are appreciated. This only further encourages them. Critical race theory is a field of intellectual inquiry. It is the central idea is that racism is institutionalized and embedded in American history, legal systems, and policies, and every one of them that has something to do with race. And that's not true. There are 5 principles of critical race theory, core tenets. Race is a social construct, as I've mentioned already. Many CRT scholars contend that race is not biologically real, but also a social construct. Centrality of racism. Many CRT scholars contend that racism isn't just based on the actions of individuals, a few bad apples, but rather it's embedded in America's culture, society, and legal codes in a way we don't even know it's there sometimes. Commitment to social distance, the CRT seeks to address why racial disparity exists in America so as to eradicate racism and eliminate opposition. The importance of experienced knowledge. CRT scholars explain that experiences like storytelling, biographies, parables, and so forth, people of color are crucial to understanding racism and changing American society for the better. And finally, interdisciplinary perspective. CRT contends that there is no one answer or one path to freedom. Instead, CRT says that we all ought to use all the tools we have to help educate individuals and fight for liberation. In fact, the same group of scholars who began this whole thing in the 1990s explained that CRT is an interdisciplinary activity and eclectic, means it borrowed from a number of traditions such as feminism. The end. But no, it's really only more of what is a never-ending story. So anyway, that is a look at this very complicated, complex subject.